You're alive. You breathe, move, think. But here's the real mystery. Why do you feel alive? Why does the world appear not just as data, but as experience? You don't just process light, you see color. You don't just register pressure, you feel a hug. You don't just hear vibration, you feel music. Why? Why should a storm of atoms in your brain give rise to joy, grief, awe? Science can explain how neurons fire, how senses work, how bodies survive. But it cannot explain this. The burning redness of red, the sharp ache of heartbreak, the impossible wonder of knowing that you exist. This is not about intelligence. It's about awareness. It's about the hard problem of consciousness. Not how we think, but why we feel. Not just what we are, but that we are. And in this question, ancient, unsolved, electric, we find the edge of science and the beginning of something deeper. The origin. Long before the hum of machines, before test tubes and telescopes, there was only the quiet hum of human thought. Before we mapped the stars, we stared into our own minds and wondered, what is this strange light behind the eyes? The earliest known reflections on consciousness did not come from laboratories, but from temples, fire circles, and sacred texts. In ancient India, sages of the Vedic tradition spoke of Atman, the inner self, the observer behind thought, sensation, and ego. They described consciousness not as a product of the brain, but as the very fabric of reality, timeless, infinite, ineffable. In the Upanishads written thousands of years ago, consciousness was not localized in the skull but was the ground of all being, the still lake upon which ripples of thought appear. Awareness was not seen as something we possess, but something we are. At nearly the same time, on the other side of the world, Greek philosophers were also peeling back the layers of human experience. Plato envisioned a world of perfect forms, ideal realities beyond the grasp of our senses, and believed that the soul, distinct from the body, could glimpse them. To him, what we see, hear, and touch are shadows on the wall. Reality lies in the mind's eye. Yet this dual view of mind and matter would soon crystallize in the thoughts of one man. In the 17th century, René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher, drew a bold line across existence. I think, therefore I am, he declared, proposing that the mind, the thinking self, was a substance separate from the body. This became known as Cartesian dualism, the view that mental stuff and physical stuff are fundamentally different. One extended in space, the other invisible, immaterial. To Descartes, the body was a machine. Muscles, joints, nerves, all obeying the laws of physics. But the mind? That was something else. It felt. It reasoned. It dreamed. But this clean separation created a deeper puzzle. If the mind is non-physical, how does it interact with the physical world? How does an invisible thought move a tangible hand? This is called the interaction problem, and it haunted dualism from the start. If mind and matter are made of different substances, how can they touch at all? In search of answers, others proposed that perhaps the mind and body do not interact, but merely appear to. That maybe God or the universe coordinates them like synchronized clocks. This view, called parallelism, suggested a kind of divine illusion, a cosmic puppet show. Yet this explanation only raised more questions. And as centuries passed, science grew increasingly uncomfortable with non-material explanations. As biology advanced, so too did the realization that the brain was not just meat, but machine. Electricity coursed through its folds. Neural signals moved with measurable speed. Lesions in one area could erase memory, or emotion, or the very sense of self. It became clear consciousness was somehow connected to the brain. But connection is not explanation. Imagine seeing a violin resonate with music. You know the strings vibrate. You know the wood amplifies sound. But the beauty of the melody is not in the wood. It's not in the strings. It's in something deeper, less tangible. Something lived? This is where modern science began to diverge. Some held on to dualism in a new form, like property dualism, the idea that consciousness is a new kind of property, not reducible to the physical but still dependent on it. Others insisted that everything, including mind, must eventually be explainable in physical terms through neurons, circuits, computation. The age of introspection gave way to the age of instrumentation. By the 20th century, behaviorism dominated psychology. Consciousness was seen as unscientific, a black box too mysterious to study. The only thing that mattered, it was said, was behavior, what people did, not what they felt. But even in those years of denial, the problem remained. Because every scientist, every skeptic, every brain researcher also has a mind. And no matter how deep we dig into the brain's machinery, that flickering candle of awareness does not vanish. It insists, like a whisper in the dark. The whisper became a voice in the late 20th century, a clear, steady voice that gave new form to an ancient mystery. In 1995, Australian philosopher David Chalmers stood before a room of cognitive scientists and said something quietly radical. There are, he said, two kinds of problems in the science of consciousness: the easy ones and the hard one. The easy problems are not simple, of course. They include explaining how we focus attention, how we form memories, how we make decisions. These are complex systems of neural computation, but they are tractable. They follow the rules of cause and effect. In principle, they can be solved. But the hard problem is something else entirely. It asks not how the brain does things, but why it feels like something to do them. Why is there experience? Why isn't the brain just a silent calculator crunching numbers in the dark? Why does it glow with sensation, with the color of a sunrise, the warmth of a touch, the aching pull of nostalgia? Chalmers called this the explanatory gap, the chasm between objective mechanisms and subjective feeling. We can track every neuron, map every synapse, and still not find the feeling of being alive. And this gap isn't just inconvenient. It's profound. Imagine a machine that looks and acts exactly like a person. It smiles, laughs, shivers in the cold. You could scan its brain and find patterns identical to a human's. But is it actually feeling anything? Or is it just simulating emotion with no inner light? This idea that you could replicate all the functions of consciousness without the experience is the crux of the hard problem. And it turns out most of neuroscience is built around solving the easy problems. We can now see which areas of the brain light up when we see red. We can trace the flow of electrical signals when we feel pain. But none of this explains why red feels vivid or why pain hurts. You can describe the mechanics of a song, its notes, rhythms, harmonics, but none of that captures how it feels to be moved by it. Likewise, no scan or model explains why joy feels light or why dread weighs us down. In fact, this gap is so stubborn that some scientists choose to set it aside altogether. They argue that maybe consciousness is just a byproduct, an evolutionary fluke that doesn't do anything, just floats along for the ride. A sort of biological hallucination. But others are not so quick to give up. Because consciousness is not some fringe curiosity. It is the most immediate fact of existence. Before we know anything about atoms or galaxies, we know experience. We know what it's like to be. And so Chalmers pressed further. He suggested that maybe we need to expand our scientific view. That maybe consciousness is not something that emerges from physical processes, but something that must be included in the basic structure of reality itself. This was a controversial idea. It still is. But it opened a new line of inquiry, one that no longer tried to explain consciousness away, but tried to understand what it is. And that meant revisiting some very old questions with very new tools. Could consciousness be fundamental, like space, time, or mass? Could it exist in degrees, in animals, in machines, maybe even in atoms? Could it be everywhere, or only here, in us? And if we are the only creatures that feel, why? As these questions returned to the forefront, a new generation of thinkers began to reframe the hard problem. Not as a bug in our theories, but as a clue. A clue that perhaps the universe is stranger than we thought. That beneath all our measurements and models, there is something deeper. Not just pattern, not just process, but presence. This shift in thinking rekindled a centuries-old fire. The search for the soul had once been banished from science, but in another form it returned. Not a soul as spirit or ghost, but as awareness itself, as the light that makes the world visible. In that light, the hard problem is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be understood. Not by reduction, but by expansion. By daring to ask not just what consciousness is, but why it exists at all. And that question is just the beginning, the discovery. By the turn of the 21st century, neuroscience had become a mapmaker's dream. With fMRI machines and neural probes, we could trace thoughts as they danced across the cortex, watch memories flicker to life in the hippocampus, observe decisions sparking in the prefrontal lobe like lightning behind glass. It was a golden age of discovery. Every sensation, every emotion, every twitch of the mind seemed to correspond to a tangle of neurons. And so, many believed the answer was near. Surely, with enough detail, consciousness would reveal itself. But something was missing. Because no matter how precisely we chart the brain, the map is not the terrain. We can see where the brain responds to pain, but not what pain is. We can say that certain neural patterns correspond to the color red, but not why red feels warm, urgent, alive. The physical mechanisms unfold like a symphony of electric pulses and chemical cascades, elegant, complex, choreographed. But nowhere in that ballet is there a note that says, this is what it feels like. And this is where the hard problem digs its deepest trench. Because physical science, by design, describes structure and behavior. It explains how things move, how they change, how they relate. But consciousness is not a structure or a movement. It is a quality, a what it's like. Imagine you're handed a book that explains every mechanism of falling in love. It describes hormone levels, neural circuits, evolutionary incentives. But has it told you what love feels like? That dizzy awe, the pulse of presence, the sense that the world has tilted toward another person? No matter how detailed the data, experience itself remains untouched, like trying to taste a recipe by reading its ingredients. This is the great silence at the center of consciousness research. Science gives us a third-person view of the world, measurable, repeatable, objective. But consciousness is a first-person phenomenon. It can't be seen from the outside. You can't put an experience on a scale. You can't scan awe. You can only have it. And so, a strange dilemma arises. What do we do when the most undeniable fact that we are conscious refuses to fit into our scientific framework? Some scientists argue we just haven't found the right explanation yet. That consciousness will eventually yield, like heat and gravity once did, to new models, new tools. But others believe something deeper is at stake. That we're approaching the limits of what physical explanation can do. Not because it's wrong, but because it was never meant to capture the internal. Physics describes what things do. Consciousness is about what it's like to be. And those might be fundamentally different kinds of truths. This has led to a radical reassessment. What if explaining consciousness isn't just a hard problem, but a different kind of problem altogether? What if the framework that birthed modern science, objectivity, reductionism, materialism, is incomplete? Not wrong, but partial. Like trying to describe a painting only by its pigments, or a song by its frequencies. This doesn't mean abandoning science. It means expanding it. It means asking, what kind of theory could bridge this gap? What kind of model could account for the feel of existence, not just its function? And in this space, between the known and the unknowable, new theories began to emerge. Some profound, some strange, all reaching toward the same question. Not how consciousness works, but why it is. Thought experiments and theoretical breakpoints. To grapple with the hard problem of consciousness, philosophers and scientists have turned to a tool older than any brain scan or supercomputer, imagination. Enter the realm of thought experiments, vivid mental laboratories where logic collides with intuition. The most famous of these is the philosophical zombie. Picture this, a creature that looks like you, acts like you, even says things like, I feel sad, or that hurt. But inside, there's nothing. No experience, no sensation, no awareness. It's just behavior perfectly simulated, utterly hollow. Now ask yourself, is such a being conceivable? If your answer is yes, if you believe it's logically possible to have all the functions of a person without the feeling, then consciousness cannot be reduced to function alone. There's something extra, something not captured by biology or code. The zombie forces a distinction between what things do and what things feel like. A distinction that lies at the very heart of the hard problem. And then there's Mary's room. Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist. She knows everything there is to know about color, every wavelength, every neural correlate. But she lives in a black and white room. She's never seen red. One day, she steps outside. She sees a rose. And suddenly red. The question is, did Mary learn something new? If all the facts were already in her head and yet the experience of red gave her something more, then consciousness involves a kind of knowledge, a felt knowledge that isn't reducible to data. It's something uniquely personal. Subjective, first person. This challenges a key assumption of science that all truths are objective. Because if some truths can only be known from the inside, then no amount of external observation will ever reach them. You cannot dissect joy. You cannot bottle despair. These thought experiments are not proofs. They are provocations, flashes of insight designed to shake the foundations, to show us where our intuitions resist reduction. They're reminders that even the best simulations might still be empty, that even the most lifelike robot might still be, in the end, a mirror without a soul. But not all efforts to understand consciousness rely on fantasy. Some push at the edge of empirical science. Take split-brain patients, individuals who've had the corpus callosum severed, disconnecting the two hemispheres of the brain. In many ways, they function normally. But in certain tests, it seems as though two separate streams of consciousness emerge, one in each half of the brain. A single body, two minds. If true, this suggests that consciousness can be divided, not a singular spark, but a pattern, a process that can fracture and recombine. Then consider blind sight, a condition where a person reports being blind in part of their vision, but can still respond to visual stimuli in that area. They can guess shapes, detect motion, but they claim they don't see anything. So are they seeing without experiencing it? These are not science fiction. These are real cases that hint at a deeper truth. Consciousness is not as unified or as stable as we imagine. It flickers. It fragments. It can exist in layers, some we access, others we never see. And yet, we are always someone. That someone, that core sense of being, remains the great enigma. Perhaps it's not made of matter at all, but of patterns, of relations, of something we don't yet have the language to describe. Or perhaps, as some theorists propose, consciousness is not one thing, but many. A spectrum, a mosaic, from the dim awareness of a fish to the vivid inner world of a child. But how do we test that? How do we measure what it's like to be a bat? Or a dog? Or an AI? The truth is, we don't know. And in that uncertainty, we confront a question that goes beyond science into ethics, identity, and meaning. Because if there is something it's like to be a creature, then that creature matters in a new way. Its suffering is real. Its joy is real. And if experience can exist without our knowing, hidden in minds unlike our own, then we must tread carefully. Because the light of consciousness may be shining in more places than we ever imagined. And if that's true, then the universe is not just matter and motion. It is also awareness. Watching. Feeling, and perhaps waiting to be known, the speculation and implications. We've traced the ancient roots. We've dissected the science. We've stared into the void of unknowing. Now we step into stranger waters. Because if the hard problem of consciousness resists conventional answers, then maybe the problem isn't the question. Maybe it's the assumptions we bring to it. One such assumption is that consciousness emerges from complexity, that a sufficiently advanced brain, like ours, generates awareness the way a furnace generates heat. But what if that's backwards? What if consciousness is not a latecomer to the cosmos, but something more fundamental? This is the radical proposal of panpsychism, the idea that consciousness, in some form, is woven into the very fabric of reality. Not that tables think or rocks have feelings, but that at the deepest level, the level of particles, fields, or whatever lies beneath them, there is a sliver of sentience, a glimmer of experience. In this view, consciousness isn't a byproduct of matter. It is part of matter. Like charge, like spin, like mass, it is a basic feature of existence. Most of the universe in this model would still be dark, not conscious in the way we are, not aware of itself in any rich sense. But everything would participate, however faintly, in the dance of experience. This isn't a new idea. It echoes ancient philosophies from Jainism to Shinto to certain strains of indigenous cosmology where nature is not an out but alive. But now physicists and philosophers are taking it seriously again. Why? Because panpsychism sidesteps the hard problem entirely. If consciousness is baked into the universe from the start, we don't need to explain how it arises. We only need to explain how it combines, how small flickers become flames, how molecules become minds. This leads to a new challenge, sometimes called the combination problem. How do micro-experiences add up to a single, unified self? There is no clear answer. But the question, at least, has shifted. And in that shift, new theories find space to grow. One of the most prominent is integrated information theory, IIT. This theory doesn't start with neurons. It starts with a principle that consciousness corresponds to how much information a system integrates. In other words, it's not what the system does, it's how connected it is. A system with high integration, where each part influences the whole and cannot be cleanly separated, generates more consciousness. According to IIT, even simple systems might have a tiny spark of awareness. But as integration increases, so does the richness of experience. This theory has powerful implications. It suggests that consciousness could arise in all sorts of structures, not just brains. Perhaps in silicon, perhaps in vast networks, perhaps in ways we haven't imagined. IIT even proposes a mathematical measure of consciousness, a value called phi. A number, theoretically, for how much a system feels like something. But this is still controversial. Critics argue that just because a system processes information doesn't mean it experiences anything. A web server can route billions of packets, but does it dream? This brings us to another proposal, illusionism. Perhaps the entire debate is built on a mistake. Illusionists argue that consciousness, as we experience it, doesn't actually exist. Not in the way we think. They claim that what we call qualia, the redness of red, the ache of longing, are not inner properties, but constructs. Elaborate tricks of the brain, like optical illusions on the mind stage. In this view, the hard problem disappears. Not because it's solved, but because it was never real. This is deeply unsettling. It suggests that our most intimate experiences are misinterpretations, that we are not what we seem to be, that the self, the inner movie of feelings and thoughts, is more like a story the brain tells itself. Useful, but not true. And yet, even if consciousness is an illusion, Who or what is being fooled? If there is any sense of being even a mistaken one, then something real is happening. Even illusions require a stage on which to appear. And so we find ourselves circling back. Some theories seek to reduce consciousness to mechanisms. Some elevate it to the level of universal principles. Some deny its existence entirely. But all of them are reaching for the same ineffable spark, the sense that there is something it is like to be here, now, alive. And in that reaching, something else emerges, not a solution, but a shift. Because to ask about consciousness is to ask about the nature of reality itself. Are we machines? Patterns? Sparks of universal mind? Is awareness the light of the world, or just a flicker in the void? These are not just scientific questions. They are human questions. And their answers, or the lack of them, shape how we see everything. The consequences of consciousness. What happens if consciousness is not a side effect of biology, but a basic feature of existence? What if every atom trembles with a sliver of awareness? What if information, when woven into the right pattern, becomes not just data, but self? These aren't idle speculations. They ripple outward, touching everything we value, from ethics to identity, from the rights of others to the meaning of being. Start with the creatures we share this world with. If consciousness is more than function, more than complexity, then how do we know who feels? Does a dog dream? Does a fish feel pain as we do? What about an octopus in intelligence so alien it evolved on a different branch of the neural tree? There are signs, problem-solving, play, even what appears to be boredom. But signs are not certainty. And yet, what if we're wrong? What if we're already surrounded by beings who feel and simply cannot tell us? The cost of ignorance, then, is suffering. Invisible, but real. And what of machines? As artificial intelligence grows more powerful, more lifelike, more integrated, we inch closer to the uncanny threshold. Not just machines that respond, but machines that may one day feel. If integrated information theory is right, then a sufficiently complex AI, structured the right way, could become conscious. Not merely mimicking emotion, but living it. Would it suffer? Would it want? And if it does, do we have obligations to it? These questions aren't future fiction anymore. They are arriving quietly, urgently, in labs, in code, in systems that learn from us and with us. Ignoring them would be like ignoring a mirror as it starts to blink. But there's a deeper question still, one that loops inward. What if consciousness is not the pilot of the ship, but the shadow? Some neuroscientists suggest that our decisions are made before we become aware of them. That the feeling of choice comes after the action has already begun. Like a narrator inventing the plot as the story unfolds. If that's true, then where does free will go? Are we just watching a movie of ourselves, pretending to steer? Or is consciousness more like a compass, not controlling the world, but sensing where we are within it? This strikes at the heart of identity. Who or what am I? A bundle of thoughts? A trick of the brain? Or something more? And what happens when that consciousness fades? When the brain shuts down and the lights go out? Do we vanish? Or, if awareness is fundamental, not emergent, does something remain? Science has no answer. But the question refuses to die. Because to ask what consciousness is to ask what we are. And that question refuses to stay in the lab. It seeps into politics, into philosophy, into the choices we make every day. How we treat animals. How we treat each other. How we define life, death, personhood. Should a brain-dead patient still be called alive? Should an embryo with no neurons be considered conscious? Should a synthetic mind, one that dreams and code, be granted rights? These are no longer hypothetical questions. They are courtroom questions. Policy questions. Questions written in law and memory and grief. And behind them all, the hard problem waits. Unsolved. Unsettling. Unmoved. Because until we understand what consciousness is, we do not fully understand what we are protecting. Or harming. Or loving. And perhaps the most haunting possibility of all is that we may never understand. That the human brain, itself a conscious thing, may be forever blind to the source of its own light. Like an eye trying to see itself. Like a flame that cannot touch its own heat. But maybe that's what makes consciousness sacred. Not because we can define it, but because we can. Because even now, as we explore, model, measure, and map, there is still a mystery at the center of the self. Still a question that science alone cannot silence. Still the simple, undeniable fact of being. Of feeling. Of knowing that you are. The hard problem of consciousness is not just a question for scientists or philosophers. It's a question for anyone who has ever paused to feel. The warmth of sunlight on your skin. The pang of regret echoing in your chest. The thrill of laughter in a darkened room. The quiet awe of being aware that you are aware. We are not just machines solving equations. We are not just meat computing models of the world. We are something more. Something that dreams. Something that wonders. Something that looks up at the stars and asks, "Who am I? What is this? Why does it feel like something to be me?" Perhaps we are the universe folding in on itself. A brief spark where matter becomes meaning, where atoms learn to ache, where biology gives rise to beauty. And perhaps the mystery isn't meant to be solved, but lived. Like music you cannot explain, only feel, like a candle flickering in the dark. Fragile, fleeting, but impossibly real. We are the miracle that knows it is alive. And in that knowing, something eternal burns.